So in terms of disclosures, I don't have any financial arrangements related to the content of this activity. Today's topic is strategies for relapse prevention, and I want to thank Dr. Lindsay from UNM for letting me borrow a couple of her slides for this to adapt. Our learning objectives today are first to describe classical conditioning as it relates specifically to substance use, because that's sort of the bedrock of the relapse prevention framework. I'll provide a brief overview of some of the foundational behavioral principles that are related to relapse prevention. And then what I tried to do with restructuring this presentation a little bit for this round is to pick out representative modular psychosocial interventions for relapse prevention. Because what I find when we've done a similar presentation in the past is that people are interested in what kind of interventions can they just pull out and use as standalone interventions without having to be familiar with the whole framework. So I'm hoping that we'll cover the behavioral science enough that it'll all make sense, but also that you'll be able to walk away with a few interventions in your pocket that I know many of the providers here really only have a few minutes with their patients on average. Hopefully this will be able to fit in there accessibly. And one note that I wanted to share before we get in is that generally the term we use for this in multidisciplinary healthcare settings is relapse prevention. But I think it's helpful to know that particularly with peer specialists and increasingly with patients, there is a movement to use the term recovery planning instead, because a lot of people just find that to be more hope-inducing than relapse prevention. So I'll use relapse prevention since that's the industry standard, but in case you want to expand your recovery-friendly language, could be helpful to know. So if you're familiar or if you're not familiar with the stages of change model, this is just a model that helps us to identify the different phases that people go through when they're trying to change a health behavior, including at the very beginning, not being interested in changing it at all, to sort of mulling it over. And the important thing to remember with relapse prevention skills is where to fit them in terms of stages of change so that the patient will be able to make good use of them. And really what we're aiming for here is when they're between what's called the action stage and the maintenance stage. So that means that they're already starting to make big changes in their life. They're shifting things around. They're being willing to exchange old habits for new ones, and or they're already in the maintenance stage, meaning that those new habits have become the default habits. So they really have some skin in the game in terms of wanting to protect their abstinence. So if we try to introduce relapse prevention skills too early for people who are not interested in change or only just beginning to consider it, there's not really much of a place for them to land. So this is really about being judicious about when and with whom we deploy these skills. Before we dive into the mechanics of the behavioral science, I wanted to go over just some general considerations that are helpful to remember as providers in this area. The first is the importance of repetition. This is not only because, as we all know, substance use is a habit that's very deeply ingrained, so it takes a long time to reverse out of a habit that's that well entrenched. It's also because chronic substance use does often impact cognitive abilities. So this is a population where we would expect that learning and integrating new information might take longer. And this is important for both us to know as providers and for patients to know, because otherwise both of us tend to interpret repetition as a sign of failure, and that is not the case here. With this approach, with this population, it is absolutely the norm and it's expected. Secondly, it's important to provide a compelling rationale when we're assigning an intervention to a patient in recovery. So this is about many of these interventions have good face value. It's obvious why they'll be helpful. But for many of them, it might be a little bit more opaque if you're not familiar with the behavioral science. So you really want to make sure to link it clearly to their goal and explain this is why it's going to be helpful, so they don't think that you're just kind of offhandedly suggesting something that you think might work for them. You really want to emphasize that there's behavioral science behind it, it's evidence-based, et cetera. And again, link it to their goal. A related consideration is the importance of monitoring. I know for many of you, you're not guaranteed to see patients too often again, and certainly not for too long. But if you do have the opportunity, I encourage you to seize it, to just follow up and ask about, how did that intervention go? And is there anything that I can help you with in terms of troubleshooting anything that came up, or how can we adapt it to your circumstances? Because that's often where these interventions fall through if there isn't follow-up. You're also importantly meta-communicating that it is what the patient does outside of the clinic on their own time in their real life that's going to make the biggest difference with habit change. It's not just what happens in the context of the clinic. The last piece here is my favorite piece. So this is praising successive approximations. In behaviorism, successive approximation just means any kind of small segment of a behavior that moves towards a larger behavior. So if we think about recovery as, a giant complex behavior, every little thing that moves the patient closer towards recovery is something that we want to celebrate, that we want to highlight, that we want to reinforce, because recovery is a really long and complex and potentially demoralizing journey. So it's important, even just for them showing up to their appointment, to reinforce that and connect it to their commitment to recovery. So we'll look more closely now at some of the mechanics behind relapse prevention. We'll start with triggers, which is really the beginning of the relapse prevention framework. So this is about understanding both the external and the internal triggers that lead to cravings and urges to use, and if they're not disrupted, lead to the using behaviors themselves. The way that I have found most helpful to think of this is that there are several components that are linked together in a chain that start with a trigger and end if they're not interrupted with the using behavior. And to remember that there are links between every component in that chain where the patient has the opportunity to intervene. And if they can intervene higher up in the chain, that usually is associated with more success, better safety, and in fact, lower energy input. So if you think even at the top of the chain, if they can do an end run around the trigger, if they're able to avoid the trigger, that's obviously the best, mileage for their money. But if we try to have people just avoid triggers altogether, their world gets very small, and that's associated with other mental health considerations. And of course, we can't control all triggers. So it's important that at every link in the chain, patients have skills that will help them to manage whatever the dilemma is at that link. And again, the further upstream we can help them to intervene, the more likely they are to succeed. So an important key to understanding how triggers are formed is classical conditioning. If you've had any kind of introduction to psychology class, you probably know about the Pavlovian response. Pavlov was a scientist in the 19th century who made this very pivotal observation, behavioral science, where he paired what is called an unconditioned response of canines to salivate in response to an unconditioned stimulus of food. It's unconditioned both on the response and the stimulus side because there's no training needed to accomplish this effect. All dogs everywhere do this regardless of their life experience. And then what he did was to pair that unconditioned stimulus of the food with what's called a neutral stimulus, which was a bell in this case. So the dog had no preconceived notions of what the bell signified. But once it was paired systematically with a presentation of the food over several weeks, the dog came to associate the bell with the food, and it became what's called a conditioned stimulus. So the dog would actually have a conditioned response of salivating in response to the bell, even in the complete absence of the presentation of food. So probably the implications for substance use are clear here, but it's really important to remember, as obvious as it sounds, that substances of abuse are many millions of times more potent than dog food is to dogs, which if you have a typical dog, is really saying something. In terms of forming associations, they're just so potent and they're so fast acting that learning process of acquiring the conditioned stimulus, so in other words, of acquiring a trigger, can happen even the first time that somebody uses a substance of abuse. So that could be something that's external in their environment, like the clothes that they're wearing or the people they're around, the room that they're in, or the time of day. Or it could be something internal, like what they're thinking about or what they're feeling when they use. But in any case, it can happen very quickly, forming those associations. And from then on, when that trigger is presented, they're going to have that conditioned response, just like a dog salivating to the bell, where their body is going to anticipate the use of the substance. And that's where these cravings and urges come in. So the bell is that trigger. And again, the bell could be anywhere and anything that has gotten drawn into this sticky web of associations. And this is important to remember, not only because it's really foundational to the relapse prevention theory, but also, I think as providers, it can help us to be more empathetic when we think of how fraught the world is for people who are early in recovery and are walking around being exposed to things that we all might think of as innocuous, but for them, because they've become conditioned, they're a trigger. So they're really living in this world of landmines, of kind of unpredictable exposures to triggers that are going to set off a very difficult chain of events for them. So how do we apply this to treatment? One of the most essential interventions with relapse prevention is called a functional analysis. You can see a really basic version of it here. You'll see the first couple columns are internal and external triggers. So this is the who, where, and when of use, as well as what are you thinking, what are you feeling emotionally and physically. Then you break out the concrete behaviors associated with use to make them very overt. And then in the last couple columns, we're looking first at short-term positive consequences, and this is really critical at the beginning of treatment. We want to make sure that the patient fully understands and is able to explicate not only what are they using it for in terms of, does it make them feel better? Does it relieve stress or pain? Really articulating what the substance itself does for them, but also the context of use. So are they using with particular people that they like spending time with? Are they using maybe in a situation or at a time that also contributes to them feeling good about it, like when they're not at work or when they're away from family members that they struggle with? So really looking at the full context of use as well as the specific symptoms in a sense that they're using the substances for. The long-term negative consequences tends to be a little bit more opaque to patients at the beginning of treatment, but it's important to keep looping back to it to help them be able to identify in their own words, perhaps with the support of a loved one with their permission, what is substance use getting in the way of for them? What is it disrupting in their life, whether it's their health or the quality of their relationships, but being able to identify what's most important to them that lies on the other side of recovery. Because it is going to come up very often in the recovery process that they're going to question why they're doing this. And it's important for them to be able to link to that motivation of how life will be better on the other side. One of the most important things that we can do once we have that information from the functional analysis is to start to develop what's called behavioral contingencies. So really, at its essence, this is about helping patients find ways to reinforce themselves for alternative activities that are not substance use, that ideally compete with substance use or are antithetical to substance use. It's hard to change routines and habits in any context, and it is the hardest context to change when we're talking about substance use. Something that's important to remember about the science behind this is that behavior can be shaped by either positive or negative consequences. In this context, when we talk about consequences, we're talking about just either rewards or punishments, essentially. But what we know is that when we're trying to eradicate or decrease an undesired behavior, historically, people have tried to use punishments for that because that is usually how we're trying to get rid of a behavior. But what we know is that punishment is not an effective long-term strategy in most cases. It requires somebody to be there supervising and intervening to punish every time that the incident occurs. And more importantly, from a behavior change stance, it's not teaching a new behavior. It's not teaching a replacement behavior, which we know from behaviorism is very important. People can't just stop emitting a behavior with no kind of alternative. So that's one of many reasons that rewards, positive consequences, are actually much more effective in this case. So that's where we're increasing a desired behavior that's an alternative, ideally something that's competing with the old behavior. So this is important, again, not only for this understanding the science behind it, but also because this goes to, the way that as providers and as patients, we're really rowing upstream against decades of stigma where society has told patients that they just need to essentially punish themselves out of using substances. We know that that doesn't work, or at least it works for a vanishingly small portion of the population. But that idea is still so deeply ingrained that many patients naturally take that tack and they think that only self-flagellation is going to get them out of this habit, when in fact, it's really about reinforcing competing behaviors than punishing the old behaviors. So the takeaway here just is that rewards are more effective than punishments. And this goes to the alternatives to use table, which is one of the most basic interventions in relapse prevention. You'll see in the first column, there's the trigger situation and the positive consequence of use. So in other words, just explicating what is the trigger and then what would they get out of using in that situation? Would it be about managing stress? Would it be about changing their mood if they're having a hard time? Getting them to really delineate that. And then the second column looking at what is an alternative activity that would have a similar general effect in terms of the positive consequences of use? And I do want to emphasize here that it's important for our credibility as providers that we're not inadvertently representing that whatever the alternative activity is going to be exactly as satisfying and easy and fun for them as using substances, because that's just not the case with most natural prosocial reinforcers. It's not going to be as potent or immediate, but it is going to be more sustainable and more healthy and more aligned with their long-term goals in recovery. So we're on the one hand giving them just more concrete tools in terms of responding to a trigger, So we want them to have as many plausible, accessible, appealing ideas as possible of how they can take care of themselves in that moment. But with this intervention, we're also starting to make this paradigm shift for them, supporting them with this shift, where they're looking at what are different ways that I can manage these difficult feelings or this difficult situation other than substance use, because we know that people who have been using substances for a while tend to get locked into this black and white thinking where using substances is the only way to respond to that trigger. So this is both about the concrete intervention itself and also about helping them to change to a more compassionate, more self-reinforcing way to take care of themselves in difficult situations. As we move down that chain and we're looking at urge management, there's a couple different dimensions here in terms of managing urges. The first one is just to be able to sidestep the urge, so to be able to preempt it if possible. But we know, of course, that's not always an option. And so it's important for patients to know both how to avoid triggers when they can, and then also how to manage urges when they do arise. So the first layer of that, and again, the safest and the best mileage is stimulus control, which is really just about rearranging the environment to eliminate or to attenuate the conditioned responses, the conditioned cues. So generally in the literature, they call this making where you live a safe space. For us, a lot of the patients we work with don't necessarily have a home of their own, or if they do, they don't always have a lot of control over that space. So it's important to adjust the terminology and the intervention to fit what their living situation is. But the first layer is literally just getting rid of the substance itself as well as the paraphernalia that's associated with it. And ideally, this is done with a concerned significant other, a loved one who's supportive of recovery to make sure that everything truly does get thrown away somewhere where it can't be retrieved. And then the somewhat more sophisticated layer here is about being able to identify and then replace or rearrange conditioned cues. So this is about what are spaces and places and activities where the person typically uses, presumably their home, but perhaps somewhere else. And how can we literally change the floor plan so that those cues are less available or at least less salient. For a lot of people, it'll be, it's when I sit in this big comfy chair that I start to use, or it's around this time and this TV show comes on. So this is really a troubleshooting process of sometimes people literally will just get rid of the furniture that they most often use in. Sometimes it's about them finding a new show or making a new music playlist, or when it comes to that time of day, making sure that they're FaceTiming with, a good friend or a family member who supports their recovery so that those cues are innervated in that way. In terms of social contexts, we of course are not expecting that people will cut everybody out of their life who's associated with substance use. Sometimes they can, and it's a positive thing for them, but sometimes those are relationships that are still positive in other ways. So what we want to do in that case is if the patient is going to see an unsafe person, so somebody who's a high risk for a trigger, we want to make sure that they're seeing them in the safest situation possible. So maybe that's a public event or just around other friends who are supportive of the patient's recovery. For many of the patients I've worked with, they've drawn a really firm line and said the one thing that they know they would never do is to use around or in front of children. And so that often is a safe place for them when they're very confident about that. And the reverse is true as well. If they're going to need to go into an unsafe situation for any reason, you want to make sure that they're doing it with a safe person who supports their recovery. When we think about how people start to understand their urges better, the baseline intervention is a record of urges. So this is literally just them keeping track of when and how it happens and what the context is. The most basic version you see here is just date, the situation, including thoughts and feelings, the intensity of cravings on a scale of 1 to 100, and then the coping behaviors used. And at the beginning of treatment, that last column is often blank or very sparse, and that's okay. That's just an indication that there's a real need for skill building here. One of the things that's really cool about urge logging is that even though it's a little bit tedious at first, patients get really excited when they get to see numerically that the intensity of the cravings is decreasing, because that feels like this sort of quantitative evidence of their success. There's many different forms of the log. If you're not using a full relapse prevention model, you can just pick and choose which one is the best fit for the patient. But the most important piece is that what they are getting out of it is a recognition of the antecedents of the urges. So in other words, what is the whole web around the trigger? And then also helping them to make it very clear to themselves, how are they responding to the urge? So what is their management behavior there? And there's a couple different dimensions that are being accomplished here. One is just making all of that information conscious to them so that they can be more purposeful in making decisions about it, because most of this at the beginning of recovery happens unconsciously. But the second piece is really about cognitive restructuring. We find that the default narrative for people early in recovery about urges is this sort of about their individual relationship with the substance, and they'll interestingly use kind of romanticized language a lot, where it's like they're yearning for it, they're longing for it, etc. It's a very personalized relationship. And we are supporting them in making a shift to a more accurate and a more scientifically informed narrative of what's happening here, which is that they are having a physiological response to a stimuli in their environment that is associated with historical use. And as clinical as that sounds, when patients are able to digest that, it really helps them to get a little bit of cognitive distance from the process so that they can step back, kind of watch it unfold in a more scientific manner and not get kind of pulled in and identified with the urge, but be able to see it unfold, see it happening, and therefore be able to make a decision that's more intentional about it. So one of the skills that goes along with this, once patients become more aware of their urges and their antecedents, is called urge surfing. It's one of the most popular urge management skills. You can find videos on YouTube of it and plenty of scripts online. But the philosophy here is that most people's natural instinct is to try to fight an urge head on, is to kind of perpendicularly battle it. Whereas if we're able to learn how to surf over it without falling in, it takes a whole lot less effort and was more likely to be successful. So this is a mindfulness-based approach. This is about noticing the urges, watching them kind of ebb and flow and rise and fall without actually responding to them. Important psychoeducation here is that urges always do pass with time, even though it doesn't feel like it in the moment. We know that physiologically, people can't really sustain a true urge for more than 40 minutes at the very outside, and it's usually more like 15 or 20 minutes. So just being able to do this long enough to delay allows them to ride out the urge. And it's important for them to know, to be able to stick with it, that the more often they can surf the urge without falling in, the smaller the urge gets and the smaller the wave gets, in a sense. So really their efficacy in surfing the wave grows as the wave grows smaller. And this can be really motivating for patients because it is difficult the first few times. So another concrete intervention that's really modular, that's easy to break out with patients, is high-risk situation planning. So this is about identifying contexts ahead of time that they know they're likely to run into, that are going to be difficult for them to manage. And this sounds like a really basic idea, but it's so helpful for patients when they can make the switch. And that's just about helping them to plan how can they spend less time in high-risk situations, so around people and places and other triggers that are associated with use, and spend more time in low-risk situations. And patients often roll their eyes about this, and then if you can nudge them to just try it out, they're often surprised by how helpful it is. And one of the ways that we manage high-risk situations is just by planning for them in a very concrete way. So this is a standard form for high-risk situation planning. You would just do this right before a patient left the clinic. You'd say, what high-risk situations do you think you're likely to encounter this week? And then you two go over together, what are some ways that they can handle it safely? And this sounds so simple, but just the opportunity for them to think through it beforehand, to rehearse it, to have a second pair of eyes on it, to brainstorm, can make such a critical difference once they're under pressure, because once we're under pressure, we tend to lose our skills if they're not well rehearsed. So you want them to take a picture of this with their phone or carry a physical copy in their wallet. The main thing is when they get into that situation, you do not want them to have to improvise. You want them to have a clear idea of what their exit strategies are, who they can call, what they can do to get themselves out of the situation or manage it. A piece that goes along with this is just the skill of scheduling. Again, this is one that sounds really boring and patients never believe at first that something so basic could be so helpful. But you need to explain, historically idle time has been associated with seeking and using substances. So idle time is a real vulnerability early in recovery. And if the person is willing to schedule out a plan that is plausible for them, and that's important, something they really can follow and that's going to be appealing for them, that's going to keep them around safe people and safe places, then the likelihood of them being exposed in the first place to a trigger, let alone following through with the temptation, is dramatically lower. And typically, once patients sample this and see how well it works, it's something that they're willing to commit to, but it can be hard to motivate them to try it in the first place. As we move to wrap up, just a few basic verbal interventions. A big one is just identifying warning signs. So talking through with patients, what would the yellow, orange, and red flags look like for them that they were starting to return to some of the thoughts, feelings, social company routines, et cetera, that were associated with their prior use, because that's often how we know that a relapse is on the horizon, when they start hanging out with old friends that were associated with use, start going back to old habits or losing the new healthy habits, for example, working out, which is something that people often do when they get into recovery. Now, I would say if you have just like 5 minutes total for any verbal intervention, this is the one I would pick. This is predicting the abstinence violation effect. Abstinence violation effect just refers to the fact that it tends to be the default for most people, that if they've had a period of abstinence and then they have a slip, so perhaps a single return to use, it's very common that they'll feel overwhelmingly guilty, ashamed, disappointed, just lots of negative affect, and that their thought is, I've screwed it all up. There's no point in continuing with this. I'm just going to go back to the old way. This is really, really common that people will think this way. So if you can predict that ahead of time and talk through with them, relapses are very common, slips are very common. And when this happens, we want you to be able to recognize that it's happening and recognize that it's essentially an illusion, because you do still have the choice. It's going to feel really bad. You're not going to like it, but you're at a crossroads at that moment. And if you can recognize that the abstinence violation effect is happening, you talk through what are the thoughts, what are the feelings going to be in that moment, then they understand what's happening and they can make that decision and recognize that they can just go with that feeling and go back to the old way, or they can choose to just make that slip a little detour and they can hop right back onto that road of recovery. So it's really about affirming their individual choice and their autonomy in that moment. Lastly, when we think in a cognitive structuring sense about how to handle slips and relapses, it gets broken down into three basic forms. One is a mistake. Two is a mistake from which you learn something, which in other words is a growth opportunity. And three is a hopeless disaster. And the third one, of course, involves a lot of guilt and shame and disappointment and catastrophization, which often in itself leads to relapse. So what we coach patients to do when a slip happens is, first of all, don't panic, because it's really easy to panic. You want to make sure that they know that that's coming and that they can handle it. Second is stop, look, and listen. So in other words, interrupt that ongoing flow of events that is going to naturally try to feed you towards a return to the old behaviors. Third, you're going to remember that abstinence violation effect that you all previously discussed so they can recognize it as it comes up. And then fourth and fifth, you renew your commitment and you're going to decide on a course of action. And that leads us to our last piece, the reminder card, different forms and different relapse prevention frameworks, but it's all the same idea. So there's the reasons to stay sober. So, that's about those long-term goals. Contact numbers of safe people who can help get them out of the situation or talk them through it, whatever their kind of breathing or relaxation or other kind of self-applied intervention they can exercise in that moment is, and then also the alternative activities and plans. So how can they take care of themselves in a healthy way in this difficult moment? I did want to wrap up with some resources related to mindfulness-based relapse prevention, because I found in the Southwest that's the most accessible in terms of training and materials. So that's what those first couple websites are. And then the last one, I want to put in a plug for UNM's MBRP group, which is free and online, and it has rolling admission. The only criteria is that patients have to have a phone or a computer in a private space to be able to access the group from. It's run by grad students who are supervised by experts in MBRP. I've heard great things about it from people who have tried it, and it's a very low barrier. So if you have patients that you think that would work well for, I recommend you directing them to it. All right. I know that was a lot of information. I went a little over time. I apologize. So I'll take a look now at the comments to see if anybody had any questions.